Darkness has a way of swallowing sound. On some nights, it feels as though the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something unspoken to happen. That night was one of them. The storm outside raged with sheets of rain hammering against the tall windows of the orphanage on the hill. Thunder rolled across the valley like a warning drumbeat, echoing through the small, sleeping town below. Inside, the walls of the orphanage groaned with every gust of wind. Hallways stood dimly lit, oil lamps flickering in their brackets, shadows stretching long and thin as if alive. Beds lined up in neat rows, each one carefully tucked for the children who lived there. Only, by dawn, those beds would be empty, still warm, sheets tangled in shapes that suggested a sudden departure. But there would be no footsteps on the stairs, no open doors, no sign that anyone had walked away at all. The silence inside was the most chilling detail of all. Imagine dozens of children, voices once filling the halls with laughter, whispers, and arguments over toys, vanishing without a single cry for help. Not one sound pierced the storm. Not one caretaker raised an alarm. By the time the rain eased and the first light crept over the orphanage, every child who had slept within those walls the night before had disappeared into nothingness. No broken locks. No forced windows. Just absence, total and unrelenting, as though the storm had carried them away like smoke. Locals would later claim they remembered the way the building looked that morning. A gray silhouette on the ridge, windows dark, the flag outside torn in the storm winds. Mothers and fathers who had entrusted their children to the institution rushed up the hill, their shoes sinking into the mud of the rain-soaked earth, only to find silence waiting for them at the gates. Some would recall the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air, though there was no fire. Others swore the air was unnaturally still, as if the world itself had paused. For many, that was the moment they knew something far beyond explanation had taken place. The official record would later describe it as a mass disappearance of unknown origin. Those cold words hardly capture the terror of parents stepping into dormitories to see dolls left behind, half-written notes on bedside tables, meals untouched in the kitchen. Toys scattered across the wooden floors as though they had slipped from small hands mid-play. Tiny shoes placed neatly by beds, waiting for owners who would never return to wear them. And yet, there was no chaos in the scene. No sign of struggle. The children had not been torn away violently, they had simply ceased to exist within those walls. What makes the event even more haunting is the fact that the staff, the adults who had been charged with their care, offered no explanation. Some claimed they had been asleep the entire night, hearing nothing above the storm. Others insisted they had made their rounds, checking the dormitories as usual, only to find them empty come morning. The contradictions in their testimonies would fuel suspicion for decades to come. But in those first hours, disbelief outweighed accusation. No one wanted to believe that an entire group of children could vanish in silence under the watch of caretakers who claimed innocence. And yet, the orphanage itself seemed to hold the answer. Its creaking walls, its locked doors, its long, echoing hallways, every corner suggested secrets too old to unravel. By the time investigators would arrive, whispers had already spread through the town. Some whispered of kidnappers who had planned the disappearance with military precision. Others spoke of an old curse tied to the land, one that had always lingered beneath the foundations of the building. A few, their voices hushed in fear, wondered if the storm itself had taken the children, that perhaps something not of this world had swept through the orphanage that night. Whatever theory one chose to believe, the truth remained the same. An entire generation of voices was silenced in a single night. Parents who climbed that hill searching for answers would never receive them. And as the rainwater pooled in the dirt outside, as investigators combed through the halls for footprints that did not exist, one fact became inescapable. The children had vanished without a trace, swallowed by a darkness that left no clues behind. The story should have ended there, an unsolved mystery written in the language of grief and confusion. But it didn't. The more the town searched for answers, the deeper the questions became. What happened within those walls was not an isolated event, not a simple disappearance, and certainly not a story the world could easily forget. And yet, somehow, history buried it. Forgotten in dusty files and whispered memories, until now. Because the orphanage on the hill still stands, and within its silence, the echoes of that night still linger, taunting anyone who dares to ask, how can dozens of children disappear without leaving behind even a shadow? The orphanage on the hill was not always a place shrouded in whispers. When it was first built, it was celebrated. A beacon, they called it, a sanctuary for children who had nowhere else to go. Constructed in the late 1800s, its red brick walls and towering spire overlooked the small valley town like a watchful guardian. The land had been donated by a wealthy industrialist who claimed he wanted to give back to the community, to protect the most vulnerable. The townsfolk were grateful, even proud, that such a place stood among them. But gratitude has a way of fading. Over the decades, admiration gave way to unease. The building itself was imposing, almost too large for its purpose. From a distance, it looked like a cross between a school and a prison, rows of narrow windows, long corridors, high ceilings that seemed to echo with every footstep. It was functional, yes, but never warm. On stormy nights, lanterns in the windows flickered like restless eyes staring down at the town below. Children who grew up nearby often dared each other to climb the hill and peer inside the gates, swearing they heard faint whispers or saw figures moving long after the lights were extinguished. For some, it was a place of charity. For others, it was a house of shadows. Inside, life followed a rigid routine. The children, some orphans, others abandoned, and a few whose parents simply could not afford to keep them, woke before dawn. They lined up, bleary-eyed, for morning prayers. Breakfast was simple, bread, porridge, sometimes fruit if donations had been good that week. Then came chores. Older children scrubbed floors, hauled water, and tended to the gardens outside. Younger ones helped in the kitchen or learned their letters in the cramped classrooms. Discipline was strict. Voices had to be hushed, movements orderly. Any sign of disobedience meant punishment, sometimes in the form of extra work, other times harsher. Yet, amid the strictness, childhood found a way to survive. In the rare hours of play, laughter could still be heard spilling into the courtyards. Games of tag echoed off the brick walls, chalk drawings covered the stone steps, and children whispered secrets under their blankets at night. Friendships formed in those halls, fragile bonds built on shared struggle. Some even spoke fondly of the orphanage, remembering the warmth of a kind caretaker or the joy of rare treats during holidays. These moments of light made the looming darkness harder to see, like faint stars in a sky already filling with storm clouds. The staff, however, cast longer shadows. There was the headmaster, a stern man whose eyes seemed to miss nothing. Rumors about his past circulated quietly among the children. Some claimed he had once been a soldier, others whispered that he had fled from scandal in another town. His temper was sharp, his punishments sharper. The matron, in contrast, was a woman of few words but unsettling presence. She enforced silence in the dormitories with an almost unnatural authority. Some children described waking in the night to find her standing in the doorway, unmoving, simply watching. Then there were the assistants, younger staff who came and went so frequently that their names were easily forgotten, as though the orphanage itself rejected permanence. What troubled the townspeople most were the stories that leaked out over the years. A child who ran away and spoke of strange prayers at night. Whispers of punishments carried out in rooms no one else was allowed to enter. Neighbors swore they sometimes heard faint chanting drifting from the hill on moonless nights. Officials dismissed these claims, chalking them up to imagination or bitterness, but unease lingered. Mothers warned their children not to wander too close after dark. Farmers avoided the hill altogether, muttering about ill omens and cursed ground. Still, the orphanage endured. Year after year, it took in new faces, its dormitories filling with laughter, tears, and whispers in equal measure. By the early 1900s, the building was home to nearly 50 children at once. The town, though wary, continued to rely on it. In a way, the orphanage had become a paradox, both a source of pride and of fear. Its presence was inescapable, looming over the valley like a constant reminder of something unresolved. It is in these details, the structure's looming presence, the strict routines, the mixture of kindness and cruelty, that the seeds of the coming tragedy were planted. If one looked closely, the cracks were already showing. Reports of children going missing for a few hours, only to be found wandering the halls with no memory of where they had been. Strange markings carved into the wooden beams of the basement, discovered during repairs and then quietly covered up. Donations of food and supplies that never seemed to match the number of mouths fed, leading to quiet questions about what else might have been taken, or hidden. And yet, nothing prepared the town for the night that would erase every child within those walls. The signs were there, scattered and ignored. The unease was present, murmured and dismissed. Looking back, it is easy to say that the storm was always coming. But on the eve of the disappearance, the orphanage seemed as it always had, strict, silent, brooding on its hill. No one could have known that by morning, its halls would stand empty. No one could have imagined the sound of children's laughter being extinguished all at once, leaving behind only an echo that has haunted the place ever since. What happened inside those walls that night has remained one of the darkest mysteries in the town's history. But before we enter that night, before we examine the storm and the silence that followed, we must first step into the moment when everything still appeared normal. Because it is in the details of that ordinary day that the extraordinary horror of what came next truly reveals itself. The day of the disappearance began like any other. By dusk, the orphanage settled into its familiar rhythm, chores completed, lessons finished, and the children ushered into the dining hall for their evening meal. Bread, thin soup, and a single apple divided among 3 little ones. The staff moved with clockwork efficiency, their faces unreadable as the storm outside gathered strength. Rain lashed the tall windows, and the sound of wind grew louder, rattling the iron frames. For most, it was just another night. For some, it felt different, an unease lingered, unspoken but palpable, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. At 8 o'clock, the children were sent to the dormitories. Rows of small beds lined the room, each tucked neatly with wool blankets. The matron walked the aisles, her footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. The younger ones whispered beneath their sheets, trading ghost stories, while the older children sat quietly, staring at the shadows that lengthened on the ceiling. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Lanterns flickered with every gust, casting the walls in jittering light. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled once, then fell silent. By 9, the rain had become a deluge. Witnesses in the town below remembered seeing faint lights flickering in the orphanage windows, strange, uneven glows, as though lanterns were being moved rapidly from room to room. One farmer swore he heard singing carried on the wind, high voices that rose and fell in rhythm, though no words could be made out. He assumed it was the children trying to distract themselves from the storm. Later, he would insist that what he heard was not playful singing at all, but something far more unsettling, something almost like chanting. Inside the orphanage, records suggest the staff continued their nightly duties. The headmaster claimed he walked the corridors until nearly 10, ensuring doors were locked and lamps extinguished. He said nothing appeared unusual, aside from the severity of the storm. Other staff later contradicted him, swearing they never saw him after supper. The matron's own account was even stranger. She admitted to standing watch in the dormitory, though she could not recall when she finally left or why. She remembered an unusual silence. By 10 o'clock, the storm had cut the power. Darkness swallowed the halls, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. This detail is crucial. The storm ensured that if anything unusual happened, it would have gone unnoticed by the town below. The rain and thunder drowned out sound, and the blackout meant no one could see clearly into the orphanage from a distance. It was the perfect cover for whatever transpired next. Somewhere between 11 and midnight, things shifted. A caretaker, one of the junior assistants, later testified that she thought she heard the children moving in the dormitory. Not playing, not whispering, but rising, as though they had all gotten out of bed at once. She admitted she was too afraid to check. She pulled the blankets over her head and convinced herself she was imagining it. By the time she gathered the courage to look, the dormitory was empty. At least, that was her story. Others believed she never checked at all. Another caretaker claimed to have woken suddenly around the same hour to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Many footsteps, small, hurried, but strangely coordinated. She swore she saw shadows moving past her door, dozens of them, all headed in the same direction. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, the silence total. Investigators would later argue that the storm could have played tricks on her senses. But her account matched what others swore they saw from outside: flickering lanterns, shadows passing windows, movement that made no sense. Midnight struck, and the storm reached its peak. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the orphanage for split seconds at a time. In those flashes, the building looked alive, shadows racing along the walls, windows glowing unnaturally bright. A villager out late searching for a lost cow described it best: it was like the orphanage was breathing, pulling the light in and pushing it back out. He turned and ran before he could see more. By 1 in the morning, the activity ceased. The lights went out completely. The storm began to ease, though rain continued to fall. Those who had glimpsed the building from below noted how suddenly everything seemed still, almost unnaturally so. No lanterns, no movement, not even the silhouette of a staff member in the windows. Just silence. When dawn finally broke, the orphanage appeared untouched. Its walls stood as they always had, the ground slick with rain, the gates closed. But inside, the truth revealed itself in chilling detail. The beds were empty, sheets twisted and damp as though small bodies had risen hurriedly. Meals from the night before remained on trays, untouched. A doll lay on the stairwell, abandoned mid-step. In the chapel, a single candle still burned, though no one could explain who had lit it or why it had not been extinguished by the storm's draft. Most unsettling of all, the doors remained locked, from the inside. Investigators would later confirm that every exit was secured, bolts drawn, keys accounted for. There were no footprints in the mud outside, no signs of forced entry or escape. The children had not walked out into the storm. They had simply vanished within the orphanage walls, leaving no trace behind. The staff's statements only deepened the mystery. Some swore they had been awake all night, tending to their duties. Others claimed they slept deeply, waking only when the sun rose to reveal the absence. Their accounts contradicted each other in ways that could not be reconciled. If they were awake, how had they not seen or heard dozens of children leaving their beds? If they were asleep, how had no storm, no lightning, no footsteps stirred them? It was as though they had been collectively blind to the night's events, or complicit in them. For the parents who arrived that morning, the scene was a nightmare. They stormed through the halls, calling their children's names, searching every corner. Some collapsed when they saw the empty beds, clutching the small possessions left behind. A shoe. A ribbon. A crumpled drawing still clutched in a child's hand that no longer existed. Others demanded answers from the headmaster, whose silence did little to calm the chaos. In the chapel, a mother fell to her knees, swearing she heard faint laughter echoing through the rafters, though no children stood there. By midday, authorities had been summoned. But already, whispers spread through the town. Something impossible had happened in the night. 50 children had vanished into thin air, and no storm, no kidnapper, no ordinary explanation could account for it. Whatever had taken them had left no trail, no clue, only silence. And that silence was louder than any thunderstorm. The question remained, how does an entire orphanage of children disappear without a single scream in the night? The investigation that followed would try to answer that question. But as the first officers crossed the threshold and began their search, they quickly realized the truth was more elusive, and far more terrifying, than they could have imagined. Word of the disappearance spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. By the time the sun had fully risen, families who had placed their children in the orphanage were already climbing the muddy hill, hearts pounding with dread. They had heard rumors before, wild stories of the building and its caretakers, but none of them could imagine what awaited inside. Parents clutched each other as they pushed past the iron gates, mud soaking the hems of their clothes, their eyes fixed on the looming structure that had, until yesterday, represented safety. The doors creaked open with a sound that seemed far too loud for morning. Inside, they were met not with the usual hum of children preparing for the day but with silence so thick it felt suffocating. Mothers called out names, their voices echoing up the stairwells. Fathers opened doors, rushing into dormitories where beds sat empty, sheets tangled, pillows still bearing the faint impressions of small heads. The smell of damp wood and extinguished lanterns hung in the air, heavy and sour. The silence broke only when the cries began, cries of recognition at abandoned belongings, cries of horror at the absence of any living soul. Some collapsed to their knees, clutching dolls or stuffed toys left behind. One mother picked up a ribbon from the floor and held it to her chest as though it were her child. Another man tore through the cupboards, shouting that there must be some mistake, that the children were hiding, that they were playing a game. He ripped open doors and pounded on the bricked-off sections of the cellar, his fists raw, screaming until his voice broke. But no answer came. The children were gone. The staff could give no comfort. The headmaster stood pale and shaken, offering nothing but stammered words. The matron, usually so composed, avoided eye contact altogether, her lips pressed into a thin line as if silence could protect her. The younger caretakers seemed just as lost as the parents, trembling and crying, swearing they had seen nothing, heard nothing. To the mothers and fathers gathered that morning, this explanation was unbearable. How could an entire building of adults fail to notice when dozens of children vanished from their beds? Anger soon replaced grief. Parents demanded answers, shouting accusations in the hallways. Some grabbed the headmaster by his collar, slamming him against the wall as they demanded to know where their children had been taken. Others surrounded the matron, their voices rising in a furious storm of questions she refused to answer. It was chaos, grief, rage, disbelief all colliding in a single, unbearable moment. If the children had been taken, then someone in that building must have known. And if no one had known, then something far worse must have happened. When the authorities finally arrived that afternoon, they brought with them a sense of cold skepticism. Local officers were used to dealing with runaway cases, petty theft, disputes among farmers. The idea that dozens of children had vanished in a single night was too extraordinary to believe. They accused the parents of exaggerating, of panicking unnecessarily. Perhaps, they suggested, the children had hidden somewhere in the building. Perhaps they had wandered into the woods together. It sounded absurd even as the words were spoken, but denial was easier than accepting the impossible. Search parties were quickly formed. Officers and townspeople combed the grounds, pushing through sodden grass and thick mud, shouting names into the trees. Dogs were brought in, but they found nothing, no scent trail, no footprints, nothing to suggest the children had ever left the building. The orphanage itself was searched top to bottom. Every locked door was forced open, every storage room examined. Yet the results were the same, empty dormitories, abandoned belongings, no sign of life. As the hours passed, panic deepened. The storm had washed away any physical evidence that might have remained outside. The lack of struggle inside the orphanage raised questions no one could answer. How had dozens of children disappeared without a sound? Why had no caretaker seen or heard them go? And why were there no traces of them anywhere in the surrounding countryside? The parents refused to leave. Many camped outside the orphanage, refusing to go home until their children were found. They lit lanterns as night fell, keeping vigil on the muddy hill, their faces pale in the flickering light. Some prayed, their whispered words carried away by the wind. Others sat in silence, staring at the dark windows of the building that had betrayed them. Every creak, every gust of wind from inside the orphanage sent shivers down their spines, as if at any moment the children might return, filing out in silence. But no one came. Authorities attempted to control the situation, but their presence only inflamed tensions. The parents accused them of incompetence, of failing to act quickly enough. Officers snapped back, insisting there was no evidence of foul play, no proof of abduction. It was easier to cling to disbelief than to confront the possibility of something truly unexplainable. Official statements were deliberately vague, referring to an unusual absence rather than a disappearance. Reports filed in those first hours were inconsistent, contradictory, and, some would later argue, intentionally misleading. The emotional toll was devastating. One father was found at dawn still standing at the gates, soaked in rain, his hands clutching the bars so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He whispered his daughter's name over and over, as though sheer persistence might summon her back. A mother collapsed in the courtyard, her cries echoing off the stone walls, until she could no longer breathe. For those families, hope began to slip away with each passing hour. What began as disbelief turned to terror, and what began as terror hardened into rage. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to know what happened inside those walls. But the search revealed nothing. The woods were empty. The nearby river showed no sign of bodies or belongings. The town was as it had always been, and yet, everything had changed. The orphanage, once a place of charity, had become a place of horror. By the end of the second day, whispers had spread that the case might never be solved, that the children were lost forever. Yet the investigation had only just begun. And the deeper officials probed into the orphanage itself, the more they realized that the building held secrets even darker than the silence of that night. The investigation began not with clarity, but with confusion. The first reports drafted by local officers contradicted each other so severely that even the families could not keep track. One constable swore that when he entered the west dormitory, the beds had been perfectly made, as if no child had slept in them. Another, however, described the same room as chaotic, sheets tangled, toys scattered across the floor. In one account, the kitchen stove was still warm, suggesting someone had used it just before dawn. In another, the hearth had been cold for hours. These details, inconsistent as they were, hinted at something deeply unsettling. Either the investigators were careless, or the orphanage itself resisted being understood. The cellar was the first place of serious scrutiny. Officers descended into the bricked-off chambers with lanterns, the air thick with mildew. What they found raised more questions than answers. Behind one wall, they discovered a narrow passage, crudely sealed with newer bricks than the rest of the foundation. Breaking through revealed a cramped room no larger than a closet. Inside, there were scraps of fabric, some resembling the sleeves of children's garments, others so rotted they dissolved at a touch. On the floor lay a collection of small wooden carvings, crude figurines in the shape of children. Their faces had been scratched out with deliberate force, leaving only blank, gouged ovals. Word of the discovery spread quickly, sending waves of panic through the parents who still camped outside. Yet the officials downplayed the finding, labeling it a storage alcove, dismissing the carvings as toys misplaced. Their tone suggested annoyance rather than urgency, as though acknowledging the horror of the room might grant it too much power. Still, the rumors spread, and within hours the townspeople whispered of hidden rituals, of things done in the dark beneath the orphanage. The search extended to the woods. Dozens of volunteers scoured the undergrowth, calling out names, listening for the faintest echo. Dogs barked into the wind, straining at leashes as though catching scents too faint for human senses. At one point, a team reported finding a trail of footprints near the riverbank, small, bare impressions in the mud. But when measured, they led only a few yards before vanishing abruptly, as if the children had stepped into the earth itself. Some argued the prints were fabricated, planted by desperate parents clinging to hope. Others swore they had seen them with their own eyes, undeniable proof that the children had left the building, only to vanish in the woods. Official reports omitted the footprints entirely. Instead, they noted only that no viable trail could be confirmed. This deliberate erasure set the tone for the weeks to follow. Each time something inexplicable surfaced, whether an object, a sound, or a testimony, it was quietly omitted, reshaped, or buried beneath bureaucratic language. For the families, this was more than incompetence, it was betrayal. The contradictions grew heavier in the second week. One officer claimed to have heard faint singing while searching the upper floors of the orphanage, a low chorus like children humming a lullaby. When he returned with colleagues, however, the halls were silent. Another swore he saw a figure dart past a window in the east wing, but the room was empty upon inspection. To some, these were the hallucinations of exhausted men. To others, they were evidence that the children had not left at all, that they remained, trapped in some unearthly way, within the walls of the orphanage. The townspeople began to turn on each other. Some accused the staff of complicity, demanding arrests. Others whispered darker theories, that the children had been taken by outsiders, perhaps trafficked under the cover of the storm. A few leaned into superstition, reviving old legends of the valley, that the land itself was cursed, that the orphanage had been built on soil that rejected life. Each theory collided with the others, fracturing the community into camps of suspicion and fear. The investigation, meanwhile, lurched forward. A team of specialists was eventually brought in from the capital, armed with notebooks and equipment unfamiliar to the rural officers. They treated the orphanage less like a crime scene and more like a laboratory, taking samples of dust, wood, and even water from the nearby well. Their findings, however, were never made public. What leaked into the town came in whispers: traces of ash found in the dormitories, chemical residues in the well water, and faint scorch marks on the cellar ceiling, as if a fire had once burned there but left no smoke or ash behind. None of these were mentioned in the official records. Instead, the official narrative hardened: the children had vanished under circumstances, unknown but not criminal. The phrase infuriated the parents. How could dozens of children disappear without evidence of crime? How could absence itself be written off as an explanation? But no matter how loudly they protested, the files remained sealed, the details omitted. What did survive, however, were the testimonies of those who refused to be silenced. One caretaker, dismissed shortly after the incident, claimed that in the weeks before the disappearance, the children had complained of dreams that felt real. They spoke of hearing footsteps in the hall at night, though no one was there. Some said they saw figures standing at the edge of their beds, silent and still, vanishing when the lantern was lit. These claims were dismissed as hysteria, but the caretaker insisted they were warnings no one had taken seriously until it was too late. Another testimony came from a farmer who lived near the river. On the night of the storm, he claimed to have seen a procession of lanterns moving up the hill toward the orphanage. At first, he thought it was the caretakers preparing for the storm. But the lights, he swore, were too many, far more than the handful of staff who lived there. When pressed, he added that the lights seemed to move not like people, but like drifting flames, floating through the rain without flickering. His account, too, never made it into the official file. The deeper the investigation went, the darker the silence became. No bodies were found, no ransom notes delivered, no evidence of escape or abduction. Yet there were traces, footprints that ended abruptly, toys carved with faceless expressions, scorch marks where no fire had burned. Each piece on its own could be dismissed. Together, they painted a picture too horrific to ignore. And yet, ignore it they did. Within 3 months, the case was formally closed. The children were declared missing, presumed dead, and the orphanage was shuttered. Families were urged to move on, to grieve quietly and let the town heal. But the wound did not close. For those who had stood in those empty dormitories, for those who had seen the cellar's hidden room, for those who had heard the silence where children's laughter once rang, closure was impossible. The investigation had ended, but the story had only just begun. Because if the children had not left, if the land itself held them, then the orphanage was not just a place of absence. It was a place of keeping. And what it kept well. When the files were sealed and the officials packed their reports away, the town was left in silence. On paper, the case was finished, a closed chapter in a ledger that had no room for ambiguity. But among the people who lived in the shadow of the orphanage, nothing had ended. If anything, the silence of the state gave birth to a louder, more uncontrollable voice, rumor. At first, it was simple stories, whispered between grieving parents who refused to accept the phrase, presumed dead. They spoke of dreams in which their children appeared at the foot of their beds, damp-haired and shivering as though caught in perpetual rain. Some described hearing knocks on their doors at night, 3 slow taps, always at the same hour. When opened, no one was there, just the sound of faint laughter carried on the wind. These were not isolated accounts. Within weeks, multiple families described the same visitations. Skeptics brushed it off as grief manifesting in shared hallucinations. But for the parents, the experiences were too vivid to dismiss. Soon the stories spread beyond the families. A shepherd claimed that, passing near the orphanage one morning, he saw children playing in the fog, chasing each other across the grass. But when he called out, the figures dissolved into mist. A group of older boys dared each other to climb the orphanage fence. They swore they heard singing from inside the boarded windows, a lullaby in voices far too soft to be carried by the wind. One of the boys later developed night terrors so severe that he refused to sleep in his own bed, insisting that someone from the orphanage was waiting for him if he closed his eyes. These stories became the currency of the town's evenings. In taverns, at market stalls, along the riverbank, people exchanged tales of what they had heard, what they had seen. Every new account sharpened the sense that the orphanage had transformed into something beyond a building. It was now a threshold, a place where the ordinary world bled into something else. The folklore grew layer by layer. Some said the children had been taken not by humans but by the valley itself, that the land had opened and swallowed them whole, as a sacrifice to whatever slept beneath. Others claimed the storm had not been a storm at all, but a veil, a cover for something summoned. The faceless wooden carvings found in the cellar were now described as idols, offerings in a ritual that no one dared name. Each retelling magnified the terror, blending fact with invention until even those who had been there struggled to separate memory from myth. By the following year, the orphanage was no longer just abandoned, it was forbidden. Children were warned not to go near, not because of trespassing laws, but because the vanished ones still wait for playmates. Parents used the legend as a tool of discipline: behave, or the orphanage will take you too. What had once been a house of care for the lost now became the ultimate threat, a symbol of fear handed down through bedtime warnings. But there were always those drawn to forbidden places. Travelers passing through often heard of the story and dared to see the orphanage for themselves. Some returned unimpressed, laughing at the cracked windows and sagging beams. Others came back changed, pale and shaken, speaking of sounds that could not be explained, a piano playing faintly though the instrument had been removed years earlier, the echo of children's voices counting in unison, the smell of smoke lingering in rooms untouched since the storm. One story in particular lingered in the town's memory. A group of 3 young men, eager to prove their bravery, entered the orphanage one autumn night. They carried lanterns and laughed loudly to hide their nerves. Hours later, only 2 returned. The third was found at dawn, crouched in the grass outside the fence, incoherent, muttering the same phrase again and again: "They're not gone, they're waiting." He never recovered, and for the rest of his life, he avoided the hill where the orphanage stood. His story became another stone in the growing monument of folklore. The more time passed, the less people spoke of the children themselves and the more they spoke of the place. It was as if the vanished had dissolved into the walls, becoming indistinguishable from the architecture. The orphanage was no longer a building where children had once lived, it was the children, the loss, the mystery, all fused into brick and timber. The line between tragedy and haunting blurred so completely that to talk of one was to talk of the other. Generations began to inherit the tale. Children born long after the event could recite the basics before they could even read: the storm, the disappearance, the closed investigation, the locked gates. Schoolyards echoed with games where one child played the orphanage and chased the others, tagging them with the chilling words, "Now you vanish too." The trauma of one generation had transformed into the folklore of the next. And yet, beneath the embellishments, the strange truths persisted. the official contradictions remained unsolved. The cellar room with its faceless carvings was never explained. The footprints by the river, the procession of lanterns on the stormy night, the scorch marks with no fire, all still lingered like stains on the record. They became anchors for the folklore, small undeniable facts that kept the myth from floating away entirely. Visitors from outside the valley began to take interest. Writers, amateur historians, and seekers of the macabre arrived to collect the stories. Some embellished them further, writing of demonic rituals, spectral kidnappers, or secret societies. Others tried to peel away the myths, hunting for concrete evidence of a cover-up. Each published account added another layer, another retelling, until the truth was no longer a single story but a chorus of competing versions. But for the families, the folklore was salt in a wound that never closed. For them, the orphanage was not a ghost story but a grave without bodies, a question that never found an answer. They watched as their children's disappearance became entertainment for outsiders, a tale told to frighten or thrill. And yet, in the quietest hours, when dreams blurred the line between life and death, some still swore they heard their children's laughter. It was during this period that the orphanage earned its most enduring name among the locals, the house that keeps. Not haunts, not steals, but keeps. The wording mattered. It implied the children were still there, not lost but held, in a state neither alive nor dead, forever bound to the night of their disappearance. And that idea, that the orphanage did not destroy, but preserve, was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Because it suggested the story was not finished. That the vanished had not gone anywhere at all. That they were still waiting inside, unseen, listening for anyone foolish enough to step too close. For a time, the town tried to fold the orphanage into its landscape of silence. The building sat empty, its roof sagging, its windows nailed shut, as though the structure itself had been condemned not by law but by memory. The locals avoided the hill entirely, taking longer routes just to keep the building out of sight. But the wider world had not forgotten. The first wave of outsiders arrived nearly a decade after the disappearance. They came as journalists, drawn by the whispers that had spread far beyond the valley. By then, the tale of the vanished children had evolved into a regional legend, cited in pamphlets about unexplained mysteries and late-night radio programs devoted to the paranormal. Reporters hoped to strip away the folklore and find something more tangible, a story that could fill a column or headline. They found resistance instead. The townspeople had no interest in sharing their wounds with strangers. Families who had lost children refused interviews, slamming doors at the first mention of the orphanage. But still, scraps of testimony surfaced. A former officer, long retired, confessed that he believed the investigation had been interfered with by higher authorities. He spoke vaguely of evidence that was confiscated, journals, letters, perhaps even photographs, before the files were sealed. When pressed for details, he fell silent, shaking his head as if the act of remembering carried danger. This reticence only deepened the intrigue. Soon conspiracy theories blossomed, not only among paranormal enthusiasts but also among political critics. Some claimed the children had been taken as part of an experiment, hidden away by the state in remote facilities. Others believed the orphanage had served as cover for a clandestine trafficking ring, its disappearance staged to erase the evidence. Each theory had its adherents, each pointed to the same conclusion: the official story was a lie. The second wave of attention came in the 1970s, when the rise of occult fascination swept through popular culture. Filmmakers, authors, and amateur investigators turned their gaze toward the orphanage, framing it not as a crime scene but as a portal to the supernatural. A documentary crew attempted to film inside the ruins, but their footage was never released. According to rumor, one of the cameramen left the project midway, claiming he had recorded something moving in the shadows, though no one had been present. The reels, stored in an archive, were said to have degraded into static within months, as though the film itself rejected what it had captured. In those years, the orphanage became a pilgrimage site for thrill-seekers. Teenagers broke through the fence, daring each other to spend a night inside. They spray-painted walls, smashed windows, and carved their initials into the rotting wood. Yet amid the vandalism, stories continued to emerge, groups who entered together but heard footsteps of someone unseen following behind, a girl who collapsed screaming after claiming a hand had touched her shoulder in an empty hall, a boy who refused to speak for days after spending a night in the East Wing, his only explanation being, "They were whispering my name." The folklore fused seamlessly with conspiracy. Paranormal groups declared the orphanage a nexus point, a site where time and reality warped. Political dissidents insisted it was a monument to state corruption. Locals, weary of both, kept to their silence. But the more silence the town offered, the more outsiders filled the void with theories. Then, in the 1990s, an independent researcher named Eliza Ward reopened the case with a determination that set her apart. A historian by training, she was neither a paranormal enthusiast nor a sensationalist. Instead, she sought to uncover the archival record itself. After years of petitioning, she gained limited access to state files related to the orphanage. What she found was damning, not in what was included, but in what was missing. Entire sections of testimony had been blacked out. Reports of the footprints by the river, the scorch marks in the cellar, the confiscated artifacts, none appeared in the surviving records. The official narrative read like a story scrubbed clean, an absence wrapped in bureaucratic language. Ward published her findings in an academic journal, sparking a fresh wave of interest. Her conclusion was blunt: the disappearance of the children was not simply unsolved. It was made unsolvable. Her work attracted both admiration and hostility. Skeptics accused her of chasing shadows, of seeing patterns in omissions that could be attributed to clerical error. Yet for the families who still lived in the valley, Ward's words resonated. Finally, someone outside their town had acknowledged what they had always suspected, that the silence was intentional. Ward returned to the orphanage several times over the next decade, recording oral histories from those who had been children in the town during the time of the disappearance. Their stories added new layers. Some remembered hearing rumors that the staff had performed nightly rituals, circling the dormitories with candles. Others recalled a boy who had escaped the orphanage months before the storm, claiming the caretakers listened to voices in the walls. He had run away, they said, but no one ever saw him again. These accounts blurred the line between memory and invention. Ward acknowledged the unreliability of decades-old recollections, yet she argued that the persistence of such stories across multiple testimonies hinted at a common truth. Whether ritualistic or psychological, something had been deeply wrong within the orphanage long before the night of the storm. Her work reignited outside attention. Investigative journalists produced long-form pieces, mixing her archival discoveries with new interviews. Paranormal shows filmed dramatic reenactments, casting the orphanage as a haunted labyrinth. Fringe theorists pointed to her omissions as evidence of government conspiracies. The case no longer belonged solely to the valley, it had become international, a mystery claimed by many, reshaped to fit countless narratives. But Ward's most unsettling discovery came in her final years of research. While examining a neglected storage room in the Capitol's archive, she uncovered a box misfiled under agricultural records. Inside were photographs, faded and water-damaged, taken during the initial investigation. One image showed the dormitory beds, perfectly made, untouched. Another showed the same room in chaos, sheets torn and scattered. Both bore the same time stamp. Ward presented these findings cautiously, knowing they would fuel the flames of speculation. But to her, the photographs represented something more than evidence of tampering. They suggested an impossibility, a fracture in reality itself. How could two mutually exclusive versions of the same room exist, documented at the same moment? Was it sloppy record-keeping, or something far stranger? Her paper ended on a chilling note: the case of the vanished children resists conclusion not only because of what was hidden, but perhaps because the event itself was never meant to be concluded. Ward died in 2009, her work unfinished. But her findings breathed new life into the mystery, ensuring it would never fade. For those who still whispered about the orphanage, she had done more than preserve the story. She had transformed it into something larger than tragedy, larger than myth. She had made it eternal. And with eternity came a new question, one more terrifying than all the others: if the children were never truly gone, if the orphanage was not merely abandoned but alive in some way, then what exactly was it waiting for? By the early 2000s, the orphanage had shifted from being a local wound and an academic mystery to something else entirely, an internet legend. The rise of online forums and message boards gave the forgotten case a second life. Users on paranormal websites traded stories about the building, often blending fragments of truth with invented horrors. For many, the orphanage was less a crime scene than a stage, a backdrop on which to project their fears. The first viral spark came in 2003, when a group of urban explorers posted photographs from inside the ruins. Grainy and dimly lit, the images showed hallways collapsing under rot, graffiti scrawled over broken plaster, and rooms still littered with rusted bed frames. But it was one photo in particular that caught fire, a shot of the East Wing corridor, where, faintly in the background, a shape could be seen. At first glance, it looked like a trick of the light. But zoomed in, many swore they saw the outline of a small figure, no taller than a child, standing in the shadows. The explorers insisted no one had been behind them when the photo was taken. Skeptics dismissed it as a case of pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and figures where none exist. Yet the image spread rapidly, shared across forums, then blogs, then early social media. For the first time, the orphanage had stepped into the digital age, its myth amplified by a global audience. In the years that followed, videos began to appear. Shaky handheld recordings uploaded to YouTube showed teenagers sneaking through the orphanage at night, their flashlights trembling as they whispered nervously. Most were uneventful, just decaying wood and silence. But occasionally, something stranger appeared. A door slamming in the distance when no one was near it. A voice, faint but distinct, picked up on camera saying, "Come play." In one clip, uploaded in 2009, a group of explorers are seen laughing nervously when suddenly, all at once, the laughter stops. Their camera jerks toward the stairwell, where, for less than a second, a pale face seems to peer from between the banisters. The video cuts abruptly, and when uploaded, the description read only, "We didn't stay." These recordings, whether hoaxes or genuine anomalies, fed into a growing online obsession. Entire threads were dedicated to analyzing every frame, amplifying every unexplained shadow. Some users claimed to hear whispers layered in the audio, voices too soft for the explorers to have noticed at the time. Others slowed down footage, convinced they saw children's faces in the cracked paint of the walls. The orphanage became digital folklore, a ghost story carried not by campfires but by screens. Yet not all of the attention was harmless. In 2012, a group of live streamers attempted a 24-hour challenge, locking themselves inside the orphanage while broadcasting to an online audience. At first, the stream was filled with joking commentary, dares, and exaggerated scares meant to entertain viewers. But halfway through the night, the tone shifted. The explorers grew uneasy, repeatedly glancing toward the upper floors, where they claimed to hear movement. At one point, one of them walked off camera, following the sound of footsteps. Minutes passed, the chat exploding with speculation, until he reappeared, visibly shaken, refusing to explain what he had seen. The stream ended abruptly hours later. The group uploaded no follow-up, and when questioned, they declined interviews. What made the event more unsettling was that in the archived footage, a noise can be heard just before the stream cuts, a faint chorus of children laughing, layered and overlapping, too crisp to be wind, too unnatural to be coincidence. Some argued it was added in post-production, a trick to heighten the scare. But those who watched live insisted the laughter had been real, broadcast in real time to thousands. As viral content continued, so did speculation. Online theorists revived old conspiracies, suggesting that the orphanage was not merely haunted but a thin place, where reality itself had fractured. They pointed to Eliza Ward's mismatched photographs as evidence that time behaved differently inside the building. Others insisted the children had never truly vanished but existed in some liminal state, glimpsed occasionally by those who trespassed. "They're still there," one user wrote in a now-famous post. "They just don't belong to our world anymore." The digital age also revived the pain of the families. Younger generations, who had never known the children personally, grew up seeing their tragedy treated as entertainment. TikToks with spooky music used the orphanage as a backdrop for ghost hunting trends. Reddit threads ranked it among the top 10 scariest unsolved mysteries. For the descendants of those who had lost brothers, sisters, cousins, the transformation was cruel, a ray all wound turned into content. And yet, some admitted quietly that the viral obsession at least kept the memory alive. The world had not allowed the orphanage to fade. Researchers, too, adapted to the digital obsession. In 2017, a university team attempted a scientific survey of the site, bringing in motion sensors, EMF readers, and high-resolution cameras. Their goal was not to chase ghosts but to test environmental anomalies, magnetic fluctuations, sound distortions, structural irregularities. Over 3 nights, they recorded hours of data. Most of it was mundane. But on the final night, every camera in the East Wing failed simultaneously at 2:14 a.m. When the footage was reviewed, the static lasted exactly 6 minutes. Then, abruptly, the feed resumed. And in those resumed frames, the hallway lights, though disconnected from any power grid for decades, were glowing faintly, casting the corridor in an impossible light. The footage, though peer-reviewed by the team, was dismissed by skeptics as equipment failure. Still, it spread widely online, adding fuel to the fire. Paranormal groups heralded it as proof. Conspiracy theorists argued it was evidence of secret experiments. Even academics could not entirely explain the anomaly. By the 2020s, the orphanage had become more than a local legend, more than a forgotten crime. It was a digital haunting, a case that lived simultaneously in archives, folklore, and endless loops of online speculation. Every new image, every distorted sound clip, every whispered story added to a tapestry too vast to unravel. But perhaps the most chilling twist came not from explorers or researchers, but from an ordinary family. In 2021, a couple renovating a farmhouse miles from the orphanage discovered a rusted tin box hidden in their attic. Inside were letters, childlike scrawls written in pencil on lined paper. They were signed with names that matched several of the missing orphans. The letters spoke of night visitors, of dreams that came too close, of a promise that the storm will bring the keeper. Experts argued endlessly over their authenticity. Some believed they were planted, part of an elaborate hoax feeding off internet obsession. But handwriting analysts noted uncanny similarities between the scrawls and the few surviving samples of the children's schoolwork. If the letters were real, they raised a chilling possibility: the children had known something was coming. And if they were not real, then the question was perhaps even more unsettling: who, after all these decades, was still writing in the voices of the vanished? By the mid-2020s, the orphanage was no longer just a ruin on the edge of town, it was a stage. Every month brought a new wave of visitors, thrill-seeking teenagers, self-styled ghost hunters with expensive equipment, documentary filmmakers chasing the next viral sensation. The building's hollow windows glowed at night with the beams of flashlights, while drones buzzed over its decaying roof. The town, weary of the intrusion, debated demolishing the structure altogether, but preservationists argued it had become a historical site. Few admitted aloud what everyone knew: even if the walls fell, the legend would remain. It was around this time that something shifted. Local police began receiving calls, not from trespassers, but from nearby residents. They reported seeing children wandering the fields at dusk, pale and silent, slipping between the stalks of tall grass. One farmer swore he found small handprints pressed into the dirt outside his barn, though no children lived within miles. When officers investigated, they found nothing. Yet the reports multiplied. People claimed to hear laughter carried on the wind at night, or lullabies hummed from empty rooms. Meanwhile, online obsession reached a fever pitch. Livestream challenges grew more extreme, with creators competing to outdo one another, longer stays, deeper explorations, more elaborate rituals to summon the spirits. Most streams ended in nervous laughter and anticlimax. But one, in particular, shook the internet. In October 2024, a group of 6 creators entered the orphanage with high-definition cameras and portable monitors. Their plan was simple: document a full exploration of the East Wing, the most notorious section of the building, and broadcast every second. For the first few hours, the stream played like countless others: jokes, nervous dares, exaggerated jumps at the sound of creaking wood. Then, shortly after 3 a.m., the feed changed. Viewers watched as the explorers descended into the basement, a place long rumored but rarely documented. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, the air thick with dust. As the group moved deeper, their flashlights flickered, though their equipment batteries were fully charged. Suddenly, one of them froze, pointing to the far corner. The camera swung, catching only darkness, until, faintly, a figure emerged. Small, childlike, crouched low to the ground. The explorers shouted, stumbling back, but the figure didn't move. Then, without warning, the stream cut to black. When it resumed seconds later, the basement was empty. No figure, no explorers. Only the sound of static and, faintly beneath it, what many claimed was a child singing. The live stream ended abruptly. None of the 6 explorers posted again. Their accounts went silent, their equipment left behind in the orphanage. Police searched for days, but found no trace of them beyond the first 2 floors. To this day, their disappearance remains unresolved. For believers, it was the ultimate proof that the orphanage was no longer merely haunted, it was hungry. The event triggered a media storm. News outlets swarmed the town, amplifying the legend to a global scale. For some, the disappearance was staged, a viral stunt gone too far. For others, it was undeniable evidence that the children's spirits had grown restless, demanding recognition after decades of neglect. Either way, the orphanage was no longer a forgotten ruin. It had become a cultural phenomenon, a nexus where the lines between fact and fear blurred beyond repair. In the weeks that followed, investigators of all kinds descended on the site. Some were paranormal researchers, carrying infrared cameras and electromagnetic field detectors. Others were journalists, hoping to uncover a rational explanation. Still others were cult-like believers, convinced the orphanage was a gateway that must be worshipped, or sealed. The site transformed into something like a pilgrimage ground, its halls echoing not only with the weight of its past, but with the feverish energy of the present. What united these groups was not discovery, but escalation. The phenomena grew louder, stranger, harder to dismiss. Cameras captured fleeting shapes darting across hallways. Recorders picked up overlapping whispers in languages no one recognized. In one widely shared clip, a cameraman is heard asking, "Is someone there?" And the reply, clear and cold, is a chorus of children answering, "Yes." Locals, long accustomed to the building's silent menace, began to withdraw. Few would go near the orphanage after dark. Shops closed early, streets emptied, and some families moved away entirely. The town council once again considered demolition, but strange accidents plagued every attempt. Machinery failed without cause, scaffolding collapsed, blueprints vanished from locked offices. "It doesn't want to go," one council member muttered during a meeting, though none dared agree aloud. Perhaps the most disturbing reports came not from explorers or researchers, but from the families of the missing children. Several descendants claimed to have dreams in which their lost relatives appeared, aged, but still unmistakably themselves. In these dreams, the children spoke of being held in the orphanage, of waiting for release. One woman described her uncle, who vanished as a boy, reaching through a broken window and whispering, "Bring us home." Skeptics dismissed these accounts as grief-fed imagination. Yet the frequency of the dreams, reported across different families with no connection to each other, unsettled even the most rational minds. Were these echoes of trauma, or something deeper, messages breaking through the veil of time. By late 2025, the orphanage had become unbearable for the town, but irresistible for the world beyond it. Documentaries, podcasts, viral threads, and investigative series all converged, amplifying every strange detail until the story towered larger than life. Yet beneath the spectacle, one truth remained unshakable: no matter how many cameras rolled, no matter how many experts debated, the children had never come back. Their absence was a wound that no theory could heal, no performance could disguise. And still, each night, the orphanage stood in silence, its windows black, its doors sagging, waiting for the next visitor to step inside. The orphanage stood like a wound on the landscape, weathered by storms, scarred by fire, but never erased. By now, it was no longer a building. It was a presence, something that watched as much as it was watched. Every board, every shattered pane of glass carried the weight of voices that had never been silenced. In the winter of 2025, after years of escalating disturbances, a final attempt was made to confront the mystery head-on. A coalition formed, local officials desperate to end the cycle, descendants of the vanished children seeking closure, and a team of investigators, some scientific, some spiritual, who believed that answers could still be wrestled from the silence. Their plan was simple, though heavy with risk: enter the orphanage one last time, gather every possible piece of evidence, and decide once and for all whether to preserve it as a monument, or destroy it as a curse. On the chosen night, the group entered armed with cameras, sensors, and, in some cases, little more than prayers. The corridors greeted them with their familiar breath of dust and mildew. Every footstep echoed too loudly, as though the walls themselves were listening. In the great hall, their lights caught faded murals of children playing, faces blurred by time, eyes seeming to follow. The silence was not empty, it was poised, as though waiting for them to speak first. The investigators split into teams. One group combed the archives, searching for hidden ledgers or forgotten records. Another descended into the basement, determined to find the faceless carvings that had haunted reports for over a century. A third roamed the upper floors, where beds still stood, frames rusted but unbroken, as if awaiting their occupants' return. Hours passed with only fragments of discovery, scraps of paper, faint markings on the walls, sudden drops in temperature that made breath plume like smoke. Skeptics among them muttered that it was nothing but suggestion, tricks of the mind amplified by legend. But then, just after midnight, the orphanage changed. It began with sound. A faint humming, like the start of a lullaby, drifting through the halls. Each team heard it differently: some swore it was singing, others thought it was crying. They regrouped in the central hall, shaken, arguing over whether the sound had been real. But their debate was cut short when the main doors slammed shut with such force that dust rained from the ceiling. From then on, their instruments faltered. Batteries drained in seconds, screens flickered with static. Yet their audio recorders captured what their ears struggled to process: overlapping voices, dozens at once, chanting, calling, weeping. And interwoven with them, the distinct laughter of children. In the basement, one of the cameras caught something clearer than ever before. Against the far wall, where the carvings stood, shapes began to gather. Small figures, pale and indistinct, stepping forward from the darkness. Their faces were blurred, shifting, but their size and posture were unmistakable: children. The figures moved not with menace, but with an eerie grace, as though reenacting the simple routines of play, holding hands, circling, bowing as if to a song only they could hear. One investigator, voice trembling, whispered, "Are they trying to show us?" At that moment, the temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on the walls. The figures turned in unison, their attention fixed on the group. Then, in a sound that every recorder caught, they spoke. Dozens of voices, but one phrase, layered in perfect unity: "We were never gone." The hall shook as if the building itself were responding. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls, dust billowed, and somewhere above, wood splintered. The group scrambled for the exit, but the doors refused to budge. Panic rose, but amid the chaos, one of the descendants, a woman whose great-aunt had vanished in the storm, stepped forward. She raised her voice above the din, calling out the name of the child lost from her family. The effect was immediate. The voices fell silent. The figures froze. And then, faintly, one figure stepped forward, smaller than the rest, lifting a hand as though to reach for her. She collapsed to her knees, weeping, as others around her urged her to leave. But before she could move, the entire orphanage groaned, a sound like the earth itself shifting. A fire broke out without flame, a sudden surge of heat radiating from the walls. Some claimed later it was the building finally giving way, its ancient beams succumbing to rot. Others swore it was something else, an eruption of the force that had held the children for more than a century. The group fled, dragging the woman with them. As they stumbled through the collapsing doors, they turned for one last look. The orphanage was alive with light, not fire, but a glow from within, as if every window had been filled with lanterns. And in that glow, for the briefest moment, they saw faces. Dozens of them. Children pressed against the glass, watching silently, as though both pleading and warning. Then the roof caved, sending sparks into the night. The orphanage burned, but not like wood. It burned with a brightness that left no smoke, no ash, just silence when the flames died, leaving only the skeletal outline of its foundations. By dawn, nothing remained but stone and earth. For some, it was liberation, the end of a century-long curse. For others, it was proof that the orphanage had consumed itself, taking its secrets with it. Yet the story did not end there. In the weeks that followed, survivors of the final expedition reported strange experiences. Some dreamed of children knocking at their windows. Others found handprints in frost on their mirrors. The descendant who had called her great-aunt's name claimed to hear it whispered whenever she walked alone. And once again, the folklore grew, only now it was not about a standing orphanage, but about what had been released when it fell. The world outside devoured the story, labeling it everything from a mass hallucination to divine intervention. Documentaries reassembled shaky footage, freezing frames where blurred shapes seemed to stand. Scholars argued whether the phenomenon was paranormal or psychological, while locals refused to go near the ruins. Travelers still came, but they no longer sought the building. They stood at the empty foundation, leaving flowers, toys, or candles, as though tending to an invisible grave. And still, each year on the anniversary of the storm, something strange occurs. Lights appear where the windows once were, lining the air with a soft, unnatural glow. Some say they hear faint singing carried on the wind. Others claim the sound is crying. Few stay long enough to decide which. The orphanage is gone, but its shadow remains, etched not just into the land, but into the people who live in its memory. A place where history and myth became inseparable, where loss grew so deep it birthed a presence of its own. And perhaps that is the true horror, not the building itself, not even the disappearance of the children, but the way grief can echo so loudly that it refuses to die. The orphanage is gone, yes. But what it kept, whether souls, secrets, or sorrow, still lingers, waiting for anyone who dares to remember. Time has a way of softening the edges of tragedy. Names fade from records, photographs turn brittle, and the living grow old while the past becomes just another story to be told. But some stories resist. Some places refuse to let themselves be forgotten. The orphanage was one such place. For over a century, it stood as both a ruin and a reminder, a structure that carried the silence of dozens of children who never returned home. Its walls were filled not with answers, but with echoes, laughter in the wrong places, songs with no singers, footsteps that belonged to no one. And though the building itself is gone, consumed by its final blaze, the echoes remain. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. Because when the physical evidence is gone, when bricks turn to ash and foundations are swallowed by earth, all that's left is memory. And memory is harder to bury. It lives in stories, in warnings, in whispered accounts of lights at the edge of fields and laughter on the wind. The orphanage may no longer stand, but the legend is stronger than ever. In one sense, it is a tale of grief, of families robbed of closure, of generations who grew up haunted by absences they could not explain. In another, it is a lesson in how history twists when left untended. Without answers, myths take root. Without truth, fear grows teeth. The orphanage became not just a mystery, but a mirror, reflecting our own need to explain the unexplainable, to shape chaos into narrative, even when that narrative terrifies us. And yet, there is something deeper still. Something that refuses to sit neatly within history or folklore. Because even the skeptics admit the same unsettling fact: the children were never found. Not a single body. Not a single grave. Only absence. Absence can be more frightening than any ghost. When you walk past the empty ground where the orphanage once stood, you see nothing but weeds and soil. Yet locals still avoid it. Travelers still leave offerings. And on certain nights, when the wind is right, some swear they hear the faint sound of children playing, just beyond sight. It raises a question no investigator, no skeptic, no believer has ever answered: were the children truly lost, or are they still there? That question is what keeps the story alive. It is why the legend has endured, why people from across the world continue to search, to speculate, to argue. Because deep down, we fear the idea that something could take so much, so completely, and leave nothing behind. No clue, no body, no farewell. Just silence. Silence that lasts longer than a lifetime. And so, the orphanage remains. Not in brick and mortar, but in the imagination of everyone who hears its story. It lingers in the way parents glance at darkened windows, the way children whisper dares in playgrounds, the way grief echoes across generations. Perhaps the children were victims of something human. Perhaps something beyond human. Or perhaps the greatest horror of all is that we will never truly know. That uncertainty is what keeps us awake at night. It is what makes us listen harder when the house creaks, what makes us turn quickly when we hear a laugh that doesn't belong. The orphanage may have burned, but the question it left behind is eternal: what really happened on that night? And if such a thing could happen once, what keeps it from happening again? The camera would fade to black here, leaving nothing but the sound of faint, distant laughter, soft enough to make you doubt you heard it, but clear enough to make you remember. Because some places don't need walls to haunt us. Some stories don't need endings to last forever. The Forgotten Orphanage is gone. But it has not let go.